I'm Nick Egan, an ML engineer here at Gauntlet. In this video, I'll be discussing our methodology for interest rate curve optimization. Interest rates are core to DeFi lending protocols. Without interest rates, suppliers have no reason to supply, and borrowers have nothing stopping them from hoarding available borrows. Yet there has been little work done on optimizing these interest rates relative to other protocol parameters. In this talk, I'll start by providing an overview of how interest rate curves work for most lending protocols. I will then discuss our initial heuristic-based approach to optimizing these interest rate curves. Before I dive into any methodology, here is a quick refresher of how interest rate curves work for protocols like Compound and Aave. First off, the utilization rate is defined as the total amount borrowed over the total amount supplied for a given asset, and it tells us what proportion of a given lending pool is being loaned out to borrowers. The borrower interest rate comes from a governance-defined function of this utilization. And this governance-defined function is most commonly a jump rate or kink-based model, which is piecewise linear with a gentle slope at first that then increases to a much higher slope past a certain utilization point. The supplier interest rate is the utilization rate times the borrower interest rate times 1 minus the reserve factor, where the reserve factor is a parameter telling us how much revenue from the borrower interest gets paid to the protocol versus suppliers. The annualized revenue that the protocol makes is the total amount borrowed times the borrower interest rate times the reserve factor. And I'll note that some protocols have a notion of stable versus variable borrow rates, but in this talk, we're focusing exclusively on variable rates. Here are the parameters that define a kink-based interest rate curve. The blue line is the borrower interest rate as a function of utilization. The orange line is the supplier interest rate as a function of utilization. The base rate is the borrower interest rate when utilization is 0. It's a constant that's added to the borrower interest at every level of utilization, and it is almost always 0 for most of these interest rate curves that you see, I guess, in use. The slope 1 is the slope of the borrower interest rate curve during lower utilization, and slope 2 is used to define the slope during higher utilization. The optimal utilization, or kink, as it is informally known, is the utilization rate at which slope jumps from this lower slope to the higher slope. The reserve factor, as I mentioned previously, determines how much of the borrower interest goes to the protocol versus the suppliers. And as a result, it defines the difference between the borrower and supplier interest rates at full utilization. All right, so our objective when optimizing interest rate curves is to maximize protocol revenue while minimizing protocol risk. The three considerations that we need to keep in mind when picking these curves are, first of all, what is their immediate effect on user behavior? That is, what do we think will happen to utilization as a result of these changes? Secondly, how do they perform day to day in periods of low volatility? And finally, how do they perform during shocks to supplier demand that will push us to areas of extremely high or extremely low utilization? Now, the core challenge that we face when optimizing these interest rate curves is that in order to predict how users will respond to interest rate changes, we need to understand how supply and demand elasticity is with respect to the interest rate. Or framed another way, we want to understand the causal effect of an interest rate change on the supply and demand. What makes this tricky is that, first of all, since the interest rate is simply the scaled utilization, more or less, we cannot find the elasticity through simple correlation because the interest rate depends on the amount borrowed and amount supplied, and vice versa. Furthermore, the biggest changes in supply and demand that we expect are most likely coming from external factors, such as big swings in price or the emergence of competing protocols. whereas the intention of these interest rate curves is usually to stabilize the utilization rate to some kind of equilibrium. Finally, there have not been many historical cases of interest rate curve changes that we could just simply look to and fit a model against. On a longer time scale, we are considering a simulation-based methodology for interest rate curve optimization. It revolves around modeling the supply and demand as geometric Brownian motion with drifts that depend on the interest rate, among other things. With a model like this in hand, we could perform black box optimization against an objective function in order to find the best possible parameters for our interest rate curves. But unfortunately, building a model like this is challenging with limited data concerning user elasticity, which is why we're pursuing a simpler approach for our initial recommendations. All right, so to dive into our methodology, instead of coming up with, some kind of system like the geometric Brownian motion approach that quantifies exactly how good a given interest rate curve is, we're going to use a list of heuristics that tell us little pieces of how interest rates could be improved. None of these heuristics are precise enough to tell us exactly how to change an interest rate curve parameter, but they give us suggestions for directions in which to move them. In the following slides, I'll go through each of these 7 heuristics that I list on the slide individually. The first heuristic is the elasticity of borrow versus supply. The figure on the left shows historical amounts borrowed on the x-axis versus amounts applied on the y-axis for dye in this case. The color of each dot in this scatter plot denotes how long ago this particular day was. And as you can see, the amount borrowed is very correlated with the amounts applied historically. The fact that borrows and supplies are so correlated with each other implies that borrowers and suppliers are quite elastic with respect to each other. Every change in amount borrowed seems to be accompanied by a proportional change in amount supplied. It's important to note that this is not the same as the borrower or supplier elasticity with respect to interest rate, but it comes close. This gives us signal that borrowers and suppliers are likely reacting quickly to each other through changes in their interest rates in order to restore some kind of equilibrium utilization. Here are more examples of borrow versus supply scatter plots for 4 different assets in this case, which are divided into elastic versus inelastic borrowers and elastic versus inelastic suppliers. In the top left, we have dye, which I previously explained seems to have both elastic borrowers and suppliers. On the bottom right, we have DPI. And as you can see from its scatter plot, there are many horizontal and vertical lines. This shows that there are many days when the amount borrowed would change without the amount supplied changing, or the amount supplied would change without the amount borrowed changing. As a result, this figure seems to suggest that the borrowers and suppliers of DPI are inelastic with respect to each other. Now, the top right figure of SUSD shows both diagonal and vertical lines, suggesting elastic suppliers and inelastic borrowers. And the bottom left figure of FRAX shows both diagonal and horizontal lines, suggesting elastic borrowers and inelastic suppliers. The figure on the left of Link shows many vertical lines, suggesting inelastic borrowers. But because we don't have clear trends of how suppliers are reacting to changes in borrows through, clear lines, we don't know if suppliers are elastic or inelastic from this figure. Conversely, the figure in the center of 1 inch shows inelastic suppliers with unknown borrower behavior because we simply have these horizontal lines. And finally, the figure on the right of WBTC doesn't seem to have any clear trends that we could point to. So it's hard to say, what the elasticity of borrowers and suppliers is to each other based on this figure. So based on all of these plots that I showed, here are 2 heuristics that we can point to. First of all, if borrowers are elastic, then lowering the interest rates via slope 1 could increase the total amount borrowed, leading to more protocol revenue, as the protocol revenue is dependent on the amount borrowed. Secondly, if the suppliers are inelastic, then we don't expect them to react to a change in the supplier interest rate. So perhaps we could raise the reserve factors in order to increase protocol revenue without affecting TVL. The second heuristic that I want to discuss is around preventing 100% utilization within a given lending pool. Now, there are two issues with utilization being 100%. The first is that it's bad UX, as suppliers cannot withdraw because all of their tokens are being loaned out. And the second is that there is risk associated with 100% utilization because the collateral cannot be seized during liquidation. So on the right, I have an example of how this risk can play out. Suppose a user deposits token A and uses it as collateral to borrow token B. Other users borrow token A, and utilization for token A hits 100%. So suppose that token B appreciates with respect to token A, either because B pumps or A dumps, or both happen at the same time, which makes the health factor of this user drop below 1. Now, as a result, this user, who initially deposited token A, cannot get liquidated because their A was loaned out to borrowers, which could lead to insolvency for token B. There are, I guess, safeguards that protocols have in this situation, allowing IOUs to kind of be given out to liquidators instead of token A, because you don't have this token A to give out. But it's unclear to us if liquidators would feel like it's profitable for them to perform liquidations when they can't actually get this underlying collateral, which they can then, easily dump on the market in order to make for a profitable atomic transaction. So I guess to kind of analyze this, first off, here is a table of whale positions for a certain protocol, with the top rows showing suppliers that cannot fully withdraw their deposits, because doing so would push utilization above 100%. The bottom rows show suppliers that can fully withdraw, but doing so would push utilization dangerously high. If the biggest suppliers withdrawing would push utilization to levels that are a lot higher than what we want, we could consider lowering the optimal point and increasing slope 2 in order to provide more breathing room, I guess, within this particular pool for these large suppliers. There's a second, more complex situation in which utilization can hit 100%, which I'll demonstrate by example. So suppose you have a lending protocol where there are two types of loans. You can either supply USDC to borrow WETH, or you can supply WETH to borrow USDC. The figure on the left shows what would happen, I guess, to the utilization levels of WETH and USDC as the price of ETH changes. So first of all, if the price of ETH were to increase, the loans that are borrowing WETH will eventually get liquidated. And these liquidations would result in the USDC collateral for these loans being seized, which pushes USDC utilization higher because there is less USDC, I guess, being supplied in its pool until it reaches 100%. Conversely, if the price of ETH were to decrease, the loans that are borrowing USDC will eventually get liquidated. And these liquidations would result in WETH collateral being seized, which pushes WETH utilization higher until it hits 100%. There are two ways we can measure the risks of this happening. The simpler way is to see for each asset correlated with ETH, how much ETH price movement is necessary to make any, I guess, lending pool hit 100% utilization on the protocol. The second, more nuanced way is to incorporate the price impact of liquidations through using Gauntlet's agent-based simulation framework with a given level of volatility, which would allow us to see, I guess, in a more sophisticated way if this would be taking place. And if we do find that there is a risk, we can mitigate it through decreasing the optimal utilization point and increasing slope 2 in order to discourage high utilization levels. All right, so heuristic number 3 is to benchmark the supplier interest rates against so-called market rates. For stablecoins, these market rates to compare against are coming from many different sources, including on-chain sources, such as the interest rates being paid by competing protocols, and off-chain sources, such as the interest rates being paid by the Fed or consumer high-yield savings accounts that are super easy for anyone to set up. If suppliers are willing to supply for less than these market rates, then they are likely inelastic. Perhaps they are using, this deposited stablecoins as collateral, or maybe they just don't want to move things off chain. So as a result, perhaps we can raise reserve factors in order to make the protocol more money. But it is also worth considering maybe we could instead decrease reserve factors in order to increase the supplier interest rates, which, depending on the situation, may allow the protocol to compete with this market rate. And beyond simple stablecoin staking, we should also consider areas where rates should be increased to stay competitive with other protocols. All right, the fourth heuristic is to study the historical behavior around the kink. During periods of high utilization far above the kink, we want to measure how long it took for utilization to come back down. If it took too long, perhaps we could raise slope 2 in order to incentivize users to bring utilization back down to safer levels faster. If it was too quick, perhaps we could lower slope 2 in order to minimize big swings to borrower interest rate that worsen user experience. Here are some charts showing data for how long this recovery took for a few different assets. USDC on the left and TUSD on the right. Specifically, if we define the buffer zone to be the area between the optimal utilization and 100% utilization, these charts show how long it took to go from 50% through this buffer zone to under 25% through the buffer zone. Based on how long we think it's reasonable for utilization to correct itself in this way, we can adjust slope 2 accordingly for the protocol. The fifth heuristic is around recursive borrowing incentives. The profitability of recursive borrowing is driven by the difference between supply and borrower interest rates, as well as the collateral factor. Based on the community's opinions around recursive borrowing, we can adjust reserve factors accordingly, since those are the simplest levers, that control the gap between the borrower and supplier interest rates. These heat maps show the profitability of recursive borrowing for 4 different assets. The utilization rate is on the x-axis, the reserve factor is on the y-axis, and the color shows profitability, with red being profitable and blue being unprofitable. The current reserve factor and utilization are in gray as horizontal and vertical lines, and the vertical green line shows the current optimal utilization. While recursive borrowing isn't exactly what lending protocols are intended to be used for, it's useful from a risk perspective because recursive borrowing always lowers the utilization rate. Therefore, it would be ideal for recursive borrowing to be profitable when utilization rate surpasses the optimal utilization in order to bring utilization back down to safer levels. And there are cases for certain pools where we can make this happen simply by lowering the reserve factor. The sixth heuristic is around shorted token incentives. If the primary use case of an asset, if borrowing an asset is to short it, then suppliers are less willing to bag hold it and supply it because its price is expected to fall. And borrowers are likely willing to pay higher interest for it in order to pursue these shorting strategies. Therefore, interest rates all around can be increased through an increase in slope 1 for these kinds of shorted assets. All right, the seventh and final heuristic is around relative reserve size. If the size of a pool is large relative to the market cap and ADV, it would take a lot of supply influx in order to reduce utilization down from 100%, if it ever were to get that high. Therefore, we could consider lowering the optimal point, and increasing slope 2 in situations like these. This concludes my presentation. We hope that this initial methodology for interest rate curve optimization is helpful to the DeFi community, and we plan on rolling out recommendations soon. Thank you for watching.